Well, it's probably impossible to overstate the importance of the great philosopher Plato. He was the star pupil of Socrates and was the teacher of Aristotle, the other great shining star of Greek philosophy. In fact, it's been said that all of Western philosophy is pretty much just a series of footnotes to Plato and Aristotle, and there's some truth in that. That's not far off the mark. So we're going to want to spend some time looking at the philosophies of life that both Plato and Aristotle developed, beginning with Plato. So, as influential as Plato was, he of course had his own influences. Socrates is, of course, his primary and major influence. And in fact, it's through Plato's writing that we find most of our information about the life and about the philosophy of Socrates. But Plato also was influenced by some of the pre-Socratic philosophers. And it's sort of interesting, when you look at the philosophers I'm going to name, they have specific parallels or relations to other schools that we've studied so far. So I've got in mind the pre-Socratic philosophers Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus was noted for his thesis that all of reality is nothing more than an unending flux. The only thing permanent is that nothing is permanent. The only thing permanent is change, or perhaps the patterns of change. Parmenides, by contrast, argued that all that really exists is the eternal. All that really truly exists is permanent, and that all of the shifting, fleeting events that we see in the physical world are in some way illusory. So you can see some definite connections between Heraclitus's philosophy and Parmenides' philosophy with the philosophies of the Buddha and of Hinduism. Part of the genius of Plato is that he's able to take on board both of these philosophies. It seems that they can't be reconciled with one another, that they're in contrast to one another, but he takes on what he believes to be true and right about both of them. The way that he does it is he bifurcates reality. He presents a kind of dualistic theory of the world, according to which, on the one hand, what you've got is physical reality, which is sensible reality, and on the other hand, you've got a suprasensible reality where eternal forms and spiritual-like substances exist or subsist. So in the physical world, you've got that which can be sensed, that which can be observed, and which can be known through the senses. And then there is a rational realm that can be known only through the use of intellect or reason. Plato gives a very illuminating allegory to explain what he's got in mind here, called the allegory of the cave. So I want to quickly say what Plato has in mind by way of this allegory. So here's the thought experiment he gives us. He says, look, suppose you've got a group of people who are all sitting in a cave facing towards the wall of the cave, and they're all fettered or enchained so that they can't move around, they can't move their heads, see anything else. Behind them, what you've got is a fire and then a series of shapes. Think of maybe cardboard cutouts that move along behind them, and the fire reflects or casts a sort of shadow on the wall so that maybe you see a shadow, a flickering shadow of a bird, of a tree, of sensible items such as those. Okay. So suppose then one of them is freed up and is able to leave the cave, right? He becomes unshackled, he's able to leave, to go out into the real, wider world. He goes outside and he's blinded and bedazzled by the sun. It takes him a while to accommodate himself to this new view that he's got on the world, but he's able then to recognize things like birds, trees, other objects, by way of their familiarity with the shadows that he had seen before. Now, of course, he sees them in the light of the sun. He sees them as they are. He wants to go back into the cave and explain to the people there what the world is really like and how their view of things is a defective and only partially true picture of the way that the world is. And of course, as you can imagine, this philosopher who comes back into the cave and tries to tell people about the way things really are is met with incredulity. He's mocked and he's rejected. Okay, so this gives you a kind of allegory for what Plato's picture of reality is like. The sensible world that we observe through the five senses is ever-changing, is fleeting, is impermanent, and it's not really an object of knowledge. The suprasensible world that we can get to and we can access by the use of reason alone is a world that is populated by forms or essences, eternal things that allow us to have true knowledge, true philosophical wisdom. So again, the epistemological moral of the story, of the allegory of the cave, it is that it's through the use of reason by which we come to know the essence or forms of things, as opposed to using sensation or the bodily senses to come to philosophical wisdom or to come to true knowledge of reality. Let me give you an example. Suppose you want to know what justice is. You're asking the question, what is justice? And you want to know for a particular society whether that society is in fact a just society, whether it runs according to just principles. Well, for Plato, in order to make this evaluation, this requires that you have a prior knowledge of what justice is in itself. Otherwise, you would have no metric or standard by which you could evaluate the particular society in question. You can't go looking at one society or another. You've got instead to have a prior idea of what it means essentially to be a just society, and then you can look at those particular societies and see the degree to which they participate in the form of justice, as Plato would put it, the extent to which they measure up to the standards or the ideals of true justice. So you might wonder now where Plato thinks we come by this prior knowledge. How is it that we have this innate or prior idea of what justice is by which we can evaluate particular societies, for example? Well, he's got an elaborate theory about this, and it in fact anticipates his philosophy of human nature and of the soul that we'll come across in the Phaedo, in his dialogue called the Phaedo. So I want to say something about it now. So, according to Plato, you possess innate or sort of hardwired knowledge of certain essences or forms. And you are born with these things. They're inchoate, they're covered over, they're sort of veiled, but when you come across particular instances of, say, a just society or a beautiful object, it's in that experience that your innate or inchoate knowledge of what beauty itself is or justice itself is gets triggered and becomes accessible by you, right? So he doesn't think that you come to this fundamental knowledge of the essences of things by way of your bodily senses, by way of your physical experience in the world. He thinks it's already back there. Your experience of particular things in the world is used only to trigger or to kick up what's already there. Well, how did it get there? You know, in the Meno dialogue, you see Socrates sort of prove that we all have this innate knowledge in an interesting way. He asks a series of questions to a slave boy who's never had any education. And the questions are supposed to be non-leading questions, but they're relevant mathematical questions. And what happens in the story is that the slave boy is able to state and to articulate the Pythagorean theorem. The idea is that Socrates himself didn't put that knowledge into the slave boy's head. All he did was ask questions which were able to extract from this slave boy the knowledge that he already possessed. So the so-called Socratic method of philosophy and of education is to be a sort of midwife where you're able to pull out the knowledge that the person already possesses, even if they don't realize that they possess it. Where did it come from? Plato suggests that the only way we could have been born with this knowledge is if we pre-existed in some form, if we pre-existed our incarnation in the body. What that means for him is that before you were born, you existed as a soul in some sort of spiritual state, and you existed in a realm that gave you access to the forms or to the essences of things as they truly are. So what follows from that, it's pretty remarkable that you get this from, say, mathematical knowledge or just an analysis of how we come to know things or evaluate things. What follows from it is that the soul is indeed immortal, and that you yourself are more closely to be identified with the soul than you are to be identified with the body. So you will live on after the death of your body, and you are essentially, more than a body-soul composite, a soul, a spiritual entity.